call Christopher Ford.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Can I join the member who just took his seat in wishing you a very happy new year, and to the rest of the Speaker's team, and also to all the members from around the House. I can guarantee that we'll argue, bicker and get to the stages where it got to at Seddon Park in Hamilton last night, but I do wish you all the best for the year. Look, as some members on this side of the House have said, we will be supporting the changes that are contained within the civil defence legislation. There are some reservations which we will take to the Select Committee and take the opportunity to ask some of the officials some questions. But on my first look at this piece of legislation, I think it will be very useful, especially to those people who do the hard graft when these small to medium events happen in our community, to be able to, as the previous speaker says, I think give them more options as to what to do when you're moving from the response stage to the recovery stage. And as a number of speakers have said, no two events are similar. And you can find yourself moving from the response stage to the recovery stage very, very quickly. And in some instances, you might be doing those two functions at the same time. And I've certainly had the privilege of being within civil defence emergency centres when events have been happening, where I think this piece of legislation will help. Because I don't think there was confusion, because I think that would look unkindly upon the people that are running the operations. But I think they've got some constraints upon them that says we can do one thing here, but we can't do one thing in another area. And I think the proposals that are made in this piece of legislation will give those people I guess, the options now and some flexibility to be able to do what they need to do when they're moving from one phase to the other. And I just wanted to make a couple of practical examples of things that have happened in my area in Porirua. If we can cast our minds back to June 2013, there was an almighty storm, and a number of households were cut off with their power. I think some were also cut off with their water because trees were down. And at the first wave, we thought things would be returned back to normal pretty quickly. And certainly the response was, okay, most people have got their power back. But there was a group of about 150 to 200 people in and around different pockets of Porirua who couldn't get their power back for days. And certainly as an MP and working with our local Mayor Nick Leggett and some of his councillors and his civil defence emergency team, there was uncertainty as to who could push in which directions and how hard to make sure those people got their power back. And there's one story I remember very vividly as we turned up to an area of Titahi Bay, which is this community that I live in, and these people had been without power for 2 to 3 days. Thankfully, the council had made its arena available so they could have showers or charge their phones, but many didn't take up the opportunity because they simply didn't know when their power was going to come back on. So they stayed just hoping that their power would come back on. An absolute vacuum of information. So we turned up, and as you can imagine, the locals weren't happy. And it didn't matter whether or not we were from the power company or from the council or the local MP, we were a target. And it didn't matter that we had no authority to put there or ability to get their power back on. We were there, we were the target, and we got it in the ear as to why their power wasn't on. And fair enough, I think that's fair. But I think this piece of legislation will enable those who are dealing with these incidents a little bit more leeway and a little bit more influence to deal with the likes of power companies to say, okay, 2 to 3 days is enough when there's 200 or so households haven't had any power. In the end, we went and spoke to the linesmen who were working down the road and said, if you don't get this power back on before the end of the day, there's going to be potentially some violence on the street, potentially targeted towards us if we stick around much longer. And thankfully, the power did come back on. But I think that was an instance where those people who were responding and moving to the transition to recovery, especially for those families, could have done with a bit more power. And I think this piece of legislation does that because, as other speakers have mentioned, the proposed recovery powers that are within this legislation will allow those who are dealing with incidents to carry out works, clear roads and other public places and remove, dispose of, secure or make safe dangerous structures and materials. Some of that might already be happening, but it might be on an ad hoc basis. It will also provide for the conservation and supply of food, fuel and other essential supplies such as water. It will also allow the dissemination of information and advice to the public, which in the instance I've just talked about, didn't happen very effectively. So it ended up being myself and the Mayor with a loud hailer on the street corner, which was the only information that some of these residents had had in the last 2 or 3 days. It will also allow agencies to evacuate premises and places and exclude people and vehicles from certain areas, to get onto premises, which is also very important, to perform assessments of any damage that may have been done, close roads and public places, give directions to stop activity or to limit the consequences of emergency, potentially for the purposes of coordinating recovery efforts, and require information for the recovery, e.g. From lifeline utilities such as power companies in that instance that I mentioned there. So all in all, Mr Speaker, I think this piece of legislation does deal with a number of practical issues that people who are dealing with these small to medium emergency issues face practically when they're asked to respond. I don't think it takes care of some of the major issues that we saw come out of Canterbury, and I think that will come as part of a wider part of the review of civil defence legislation that is to come. Which is one of the criticisms that we have with this piece of legislation, is that maybe perhaps it could have been part of a catch-all review of civil defence legislation as reviews happen. In this instance, it hasn't happened, and I guess something is better than nothing. But we'll have the opportunity to question the merits of the approach also in the Select Committee hearings. But I guess it will make a positive difference. It will give, hopefully, those people who, like Trevor Farmer in my area, the power to do some things that they haven't been able to do when you do have floodings or storms, also that we saw up on the Kapiti coast late last year. And hopefully that will make the lives easier for the people who are affected, but also for the people who are responding and helping with the recovery to some of these incidents.